Hi everyone, my name's Steve and today is the 12th of July 2018 and this is my first entry into my video journal all about emetophobia and CBT. I decided to start this journal because I'm just about to start with my CBT therapy for emetophobia, and I thought it would be a nice way for me to keep up with everything that I've gone through and kind of reflect on what I've experienced. I also decided that I'd make it public because I know that there's a lot of other people out there who struggle with this same phobia, and I hope that maybe someone will find it useful and give them more of an idea of what CBT is all about and what you actually go through. If you are an emetophobia sufferer and you're watching these videos, I will just give you a trigger warning that there will be use of certain terms that you may find uncomfortable. Unfortunately, it's not possible to talk about this without using those terms, so just bear that in mind. But I do recommend, if you feel that way, it's worth trying to watch through if you can anyway. A lot of CBT is actually about facing your fears and going through that process, so it's good practice to try and kind of stick it through when you can. For anyone who's not familiar with emetophobia, it's quite a common phobia. It's basically a fear of being sick, a fear of vomiting, but it does extend beyond that. It does cover a lot of different things, and sometimes it can turn into obsessive compulsive behaviours, or it can also turn into agoraphobia and things like that, which I'll explain a little about in my own experiences. So my own story goes back quite a way, really. When I was younger, I used to be quite a fussy eater. I was a very slow eater. I didn't particularly have much of an appetite, but there was always a pressure on me to try and eat as much as I could. Quite often I would end up feeling a bit sick every time that I ate, and it kind of, or I'd feel bloated or anything like that. And I'd usually end up sat by the toilet trying to kind of, just in case I was sick, which I virtually never was. When I reached my teens I was a bit better, and I'd kind of eat a lot more, and I started growing and everything seemed fine. When I was 18, I went to see the Foo Fighters in Manchester, and I was right at the front of the crowd, and it was really crushed in. I could lift my feet from the floor without going anywhere because it was so crowded. At some point in the gig, the crowd started swaying and I fell down, and lots of other people started falling on top of me, and I really started to panic. I even thought for a second that I was actually going to die. Genuinely believed I was about to die. But then people pulled me up and, they got me out of the crowd, and it was all fine really in the end. But I immediately started dry heaving, so people kind of pushed me out of the way and they got me out of the crowd. But from that moment I pretty much always associated confined spaces with being sick. So when I started university that same year, I wouldn't sit in the middle row on lectures. I'd always sit near the door. I couldn't use busy trains. I'd always have to use it when it was quiet, and I knew that I could get to the toilet quite easily. I didn't particularly like being in open spaces even, so, because it felt like, especially if the weather was hot, because it felt like I couldn't get to a toilet or something in case I needed to be sick. So yeah, I'd kind of created this association in my head, and I started to see it as agoraphobia, as being unable to go out to these places. Generally day to day I was fine, but it was particular circumstances where I felt trapped. Initially I tried a bit of CBT for that. That didn't really go anywhere. I didn't stick to it. And then I went to some group sessions where we talked about fear and anxiety and how it works, fight or flight response, how your brain processes this information and why we experience these unnecessary fears. And that was really useful because it definitely helps me get around panic attacks and things like that, and I had a lot more control over it, and I'll probably do a bit of a video about that at some point as well. And for a while things were fine. I was managing, I was getting on trains and travelling around, and I even managed to take a couple of flights. I went over to Dublin and I went over to Amsterdam, and those would have originally been my biggest fears, so that kind of seemed like everything was going fine. In January last year I left my job and I took up freelance work, so I was working for myself from home. Without realising, I became very comfortable at home. In fact, there would be days where I wouldn't have to leave the house. But that meant that whenever I did go out, I was a lot more anxious than I used to be, and all of a sudden just walking to the shop became a bit difficult. But I also started to find that even when I was at home, if I felt ill, if I felt sick in any way, then, suddenly knowing that I had somewhere to go, that I had my own bathroom and things, wasn't helping me anymore, and in fact I was still quite nervous. In September I moved to Brighton, and I started recognising that this was definitely a lot more about emetophobia than agoraphobia. So things like the fact that I share a bathroom with 2 other people. Whenever it's in use, I start to get nervous. I had to travel to university every day on the bus, and that was quite uncomfortable even though I could get off the bus. There's definitely been a few times while I've been here where I felt quite ill and I probably should have been sick, but I wasn't, just because the experience of being sick is too terrifying for me. A few weeks ago I went to a festival in London. We were staying about half an hour away from the venue, so we had to kind of travel back and forth in taxis. But spending the day at the venue, kind of surrounded by people and friends and not really having any way out. You know, you leave the venue but you're just in the streets in London still. So I still felt quite, confined where I was. And even the taxi ride back, it's half an hour in a taxi, it's quite uncomfortable. I kept thinking, what if I need to be sick at any point on this journey? So again, I had to kind of control and repress the panic. But once I got back to the hotel, I was fine, and I managed. Last week I took a trip up to Sheffield and Manchester again to see family and friends. It was really hot. We took a 4-hour train journey there, and there were several times kind of walking around town where I couldn't deal with the heat and I started to panic, and I essentially just couldn't walk around town. I had already been receiving some help from the Brighton and Hove Wellbeing Centre. They had me on some general kind of anxiety processes. It was just basic phone appointments every week, where we were kind of going through exposure exercises and trying to get more used to going out of my comfort zone. But it didn't really seem to be working, and we decided that we'd move it up to actual full CBT sessions. I'd realised that there were a few times when I was starting to also develop some OCD behaviours, so I was worried about hygiene, about what was clean, whether I was kind of contaminating myself at any point, with the risk that these might cause me to be sick if I was to get some kind of bug. So I knew that I was really struggling, and I knew that I needed to do more, and that's when we decided to move it up to actual CBT. Normally there's a really long wait list, but I think I was quite lucky that I managed to get in. And I had my first appointment this morning. So the first appointment that you have with CBT is actually quite basic. Really, it was just me explaining to the therapist about what happens in my head, trying to dig back, essentially telling you everything that I've just told you now. Going through my own experiences, my childhood, talking about what I think about, what's going on in my head, what my worst case scenario is. Just trying to explain to the therapist what is actually happening so that they have an idea of what they need to work on. What she did do was kind of try to dig into a few situations that I talked about. So I talked about the gig with the Foo Fighters, how I'd had that experience. And then we started talking about times when I had been sick and, what had happened there. For example, we went back to a point when I would have been about 11 or 12, and I was sick at school. And I'd run to the toilets. It was lunch breaks, lots of people in there, and everyone saw me being sick, and everyone started commenting and saying how disgusting it was and kind of laughing at me as well. So she was saying that maybe there's something in there that could have triggered something. Maybe the pressure from when I was younger to kind of eat more than I wanted to, and being told off for wasting food, and really trying to pinpoint what my actual fears are. So being afraid of being sick is one thing, but there's lots of reasons why someone might be afraid of that, whether it's embarrassment, whether it's the physical sensation, which for me it's kind of both of those things. I don't really want to be seen, but also it's a physically awful sensation. I really hurts me when it happens, which is why I would try and avoid it all the time. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. Like I say, it's only been the first appointment, so there's not really much happened at this point. I will say it was a little bit difficult. I did have to discuss in detail, talk about being sick, which is not something I like doing, but I kind of persevered, and my therapist understood, and she said, if you do find this too difficult to talk about, then just let me know and we can kind of reel things back a little bit. Essentially, the process is about exposure and facing your fears, and talking about that is one part of it. So I said, I understand that I'm going to have to do this. I've got to go through it. I've got to talk about it. So I just kind of went along with it, and I kind of sat through this session. It was about an hour long, and it was fine. really it was fine. You know, it was uncomfortable at times, but the therapist was very understanding, very comforting, and really helpful. So I've got another session next week, which I'll make another video for when that's done, just to give you an idea of the process. And that's about it. So for anyone else who's out there who's watching, hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight. If you do have any questions, by all means drop me a comment. I'm not really sure what I can say at this point, but yeah, I'll keep you updated as I go. Thanks.